So I know a lot of you that have followed me for a long time have enjoyed my character building for PvE, and I know at least a few people were excited to see me start playing PvP for the first time with the release of Last Stand. So today is my first character build for PvP, and it's a pretty interesting build. For those of you that have just recently followed, and I appreciate that, I spend a ton of time fine-tuning every aspect of builds before releasing them, and when I do videos I don't just hand you the stats and roles and say okay, go do this. Instead, I like to explain the goal of the build and explain some of the reasoning behind the build, as well as some of the math to back up the decisions, so that way when you leave the video and try to replicate the build, you understand what it is you're trying to do and have the knowledge to adjust the build to your own playstyle and liking that may better suit you. But usually, in my opinion, the build is fine-tuned to the point that it has the best aspects of each stat taken into consideration to the best of my knowledge and ability at the time. So with that said, let's talk about this build. Due to the enormous amount of heartache I have seen in comments about the current state of the game, I abandoned group this week and went solo nearly the entire week in PvP to start working on a build to counter the current builds that exist. I didn't expect to be very successful because I felt that the current system likely would not allow for one build to be very good at everything, and for every build I countered, there would be a build to counter mine. But after concluding this build, I am sad to say that I have put together a build that counters every build of my knowledge in the game currently. The main reason for this build's ability to counter other builds so effectively is that I have found an inefficiency in the way players are allocating stats on mods with regards to health rolls to create toughness. I've been guilty of the same mistake myself so far, but not any longer. So I noticed after a few games the other day, after having a very few good games in a row, that I was running 2-piece Tactician, a Vigorous Chest Piece, 1-piece Final Measure, 1-piece Nomad, and 1-piece Firecrest. It sounds really confusing, right? Well, it was to me too, and so I switched over and I tried what I wanted to try, which was 4-piece Striker and 2-piece Tactician, and it was just worse. And then I was really curious about what was happening, but I knew it had something to do with what I was attempting to work on already, which was stacking up skill haste and using heals as a way to create toughness. So I started looking at toughness, damage mitigation 1.6, the skills I was using, and started doing some math, and what I found was this. When running a Vigorous Chest Piece and 2-piece Tactician, I was extremely tanky, and so I started working on calculations of just how tanky I was in terms of toughness with stuff due to heals. So let's look at the toughness calculator. With 35% armor mitigation and 207,000 health, which is approximately what this build has in Last Stand, my toughness is 318,462. That's extremely squishy. Outside of Last Stand, it's 285,000 toughness to give you an idea of just how low it is. So let's look at Booster Shot's damage mitigation. It gives us 10%, but instead let's change that number into its equivalent in health or armor, which allows us to add it to our toughness. After you do that math, Booster Shot is the same thing as having 41.5% armor, bringing our total toughness to 353,846 while it's up. Instead of armor though, since we can't get armor rolls on mods anymore, let's convert that into health instead. 230,000 health and 35% armor mitigation gets us to the exact same number, which means that Booster Shot is the equivalent of 23,000 health in regards to toughness. So if we look at health rolls on mods, we get a max of about 3,350 for 5 mods. That nets us 16,750 total health from mods versus 23,000 health from Booster's damage mitigation. That's a difference of 6,250 health, or in other terms 417 stamina points in patch 1.6, double what it would have been in patch 1.5. Now let's look at an overheal. How much health does an overheal actually contain in it? Well, the answer is slightly above 100,000, which is 6,667 stamina points in 1.6, essentially more stamina points than any character runs on average. So, when we run a Vigorous Chest Piece, we get an overheal from Booster. If we can get our Booster Shot heal up to 100k, at that point our effective toughness, although it doesn't show it in our character screen, is 35% armor mitigation with 330,000 health, or in other terms is 41.5% armor mitigation with 307,000 health, either of which bring our total toughness at that point to 507,692. I don't need to tell you that that's a very large number. Furthermore, we gain 10% damage increase from Booster Shot also. So the question now becomes, how often can we keep our Booster Shot up? If the answer is always, or really if we can just almost always keep it up, then it should be quite obvious that this is by far the most effective means for gaining toughness in the game. The only question is, how much do we have to invest into electronics so that takes away from our firearms and DPS to create the situation where we keep booster shot up and create this enormous amount of toughness? And that answer is not very high. It's only about 250,000 skill power that we need, which we're going to achieve while leaving ourselves nearly 5,500 firearms left over for DPS, which is plenty to kill anybody. So what does all of that mean? We can now make a blanketed statement of mathematical fact about the current state of the game. A few things. It is mathematically more efficient to invest points into firearms and skill power than it is stamina. We know that already. It is also more efficient to roll health on mods and gain health through that means than it is to roll points into stamina to gain health. We also pretty much know that already. But once we put on two-piece tacticians, it is mathematically a fact. It is more efficient to roll all mods to skill haste over health to gain toughness through our heals. There are things that I believe are likely true, but won't state them as fact yet. It is my opinion currently, based on speculation, that if thoroughly looked at, that the most effective build in current future meta of 1.6 will be hybrid builds that invest no points into stamina and invest all points into firearms and electronics, and stack skill haste to increase DPS, toughness, and utility through skills while maintaining a very respectable DPS. These builds will counter all non-balanced builds that invest too heavily into firearms or electronics, such as 9.5k Deadeye builds or 9k Electronic Seeker one-shot builds. They will also counter builds that seek to stack into stamina to offset some of the damage that some of these other builds are doing because it is inefficient to do it that way. It is also my opinion that the Vigorous Chest Piece, two-piece tacticians with all skill haste mods and booster shot will soon potentially be the foundation to the best builds in 1.6. And that is the biggest thing I want everyone to take away from this video. The scary part to me, as someone who touted 1.6 so far to be diverse and have a counter to every build so far, is that this build functions as well in a group as it does solo, meaning that this build may be the new alpha bridge, and anyone not running some form of it will be at a disadvantage. I still don't believe that a 4-man group is most efficient with 4 of these builds, but I do believe that this build is a cornerstone to any group as a secondary DPS player and an off-healer granting non-stop booster shots for a group of 4 and outputting a very high damage output at the same time. But what I really want to look at right now, because this is what I started off doing, is looking at the final version of this build in terms of a solo player or a player in a group of 2 or less, or for that matter a player that is inside of a group without a dedicated healer. There's a few changes that I would make if I was in a group that had a dedicated healer, but we're going to look at a solo build today, okay? So like I said, we of course have a Vigorous Chest as our chest piece with the skill haste and health rolled here. We can ignore exotic damage resilience here because we're going to tank Seeker Mines through that overheal, and we're going to take skill haste because of the reasons discussed already. The backpack, we're going to use Specialized to help get our skill power up, and we're going to make use of that 5,500 firearms that we're going to be investing in and move some of that over into skill power efficiently. Health is going to be the major role on the backpack. The rest is optional in my opinion as far as what gear pieces you use from here, but I recommend the following as long as at least 2 pieces of tactician are involved. And this is my build here. A tactician mask rolled with skill power, tactician knee pads rolled to health, a tactician holster rolled to reload speed. Savage gloves rolled to crit damage, skill haste, and SMG damage. Now I've tried 2-piece tactician with a nimble holster and savage gloves, but it didn't fit my playstyle very well. It may be better suited towards someone else's. The extra 10% skill power from 3-piece tactician was far more important to me personally. Some may rather run the nimble holster, for instance. I only recommend the Tenacious Mask in a group build with a dedicated healer where you'll be using your med kits as an offensive tool. In this build, your med kit is vital to your survivability when you're at low health to recover from low health and get back to your full overheal to be on the offensive again. This build isn't about blowing your load on a guy in the first 5 seconds. It's about him blowing his load on you in the first 5 seconds, and then if he does that and he doesn't burst you down, then he dies. Period. Short bow knee pads are definitely an option, but I still take Savage gloves over them because of my ability to change out skills, which I'll talk about in a second. My gun talents are competent, giving me 10% damage after using a skill, which is nearly all the time, and will be active while booster shot is active also, which is nearly all the time, a 20% damage increase. Responsive is also what I'm running, although you could move out of this into something like brutal or some other stat that doesn't require you to run a stamina mod, which you're going to have to do if you run responsive and the other talents that I've done. And I'm running vicious as my third talent, giving me 10% critical hit chance while over 2 health segments, which is almost all the time. And the only time that I'm on the offensive is when I have an overheal, and that is almost all the time, if you're catching my drift so far. Inside of 10 meters with an overheal, we are effectively sitting at over 500,000 DPS, 500,000 toughness, and 250,000 skill power when we are really going. That is a force to be reckoned with. But with all of our skills down, our overheal down, we are extremely vulnerable. But all you need to do is find yourself a 3 to 4 second window to recover because of the amount of skill haste that we're able to achieve in the game now. And you can come back roaring and overwhelm the less efficient builds others are currently running. My character talents are triage, strike back, and on the move, and I rotate between those. These are all dependent upon playstyle. Strike back, in my opinion, is crucial for any solo player to keep the skill cooldown when you get to low health. Sometimes it's just the difference between living and dying and being able to come back and take over the confrontation between you and another player. So as I said before about the Savage gloves allowing me some options for skills instead of the knee pads. By running Savage, I get my crit up to about 42%. My crit damage is already over 100 and something. So many people run pulses in PvP, as we know. And so I feel comfortable most matches allowing others to do that instead of me running it myself. With 42% crit chance, I don't need someone to have gigantic skill power for me to almost be at the cap. And with 250,000 skill power myself, it actually puts me slightly over the cap. So I like the ability to change in and out my skills dependent upon who I'm playing against and what type of players I'm playing against. So, if the opposition is running a lot of skill power builds with Seeker mines, I will also run Seekers as a counter for 2 reasons. 1. Seekers shoot down Seekers. My Seekers cost me 250,000 skill power. Your one-shot Seeker, which doesn't one-shot me anymore with this build, mainly because of my overheal, costs you everything you have to throw it at me. And I'm taking yours out with a more efficient means with a less powerful Seeker. So we are taking away their most damaging skill with a cheaper version of the exact same thing. Second, many players who go nuts with nothing but skill power and refuse to use solid heals or invest in stamina will be one-shot by my Seeker at 250,000 skill power because they are unbalanced. If the opposition is full of 9k Deadeye builds, I will also run Seekers. Number 1, it will push them off their spots they want to set up on. They like the line of sight down long roads, for instance. They are also one-shot by my 250,000 skill power Seekers, the same exact way that low toughness 9k skill power players are also one-shot by my Seekers. And they are aiming through their scopes, so they are very unaware of what's going on around them, so this makes them kind of easy targets a lot of times. In close quarter maps, such as the sports store map, I like to run a shock torrent and put them around corners and things. If I'm up against players with good DPS, but they've invested something into stamina, and I notice myself having issues getting them down, I will switch over to Pulse at that point. And that's usually enough DPS boost to remove them from the equation and making use of our strong Pulse at 23% crit and 24% crit damage, and taking advantage of the inefficiency of them putting stats into stamina, and we actually have more toughness than they do and a relative DPS. And that is the reason I like to use the Savage gloves, for the diversity that it allows me to change out pulse for other skills and maintain high DPS if someone isn't pulsing around me or someone else's pulse around me isn't very good. So let's close all this out with what this build counters and how this build counters other less efficient builds. Builds that stack everything into firearms falter because they are not able to burst you down due to the high amount of toughness achieved through your heal, rendering them as more of an annoyance than instant death with other builds. We can one-shot them with Seekers, or we can burst them down easier due to our high DPS and their low toughness. Builds that stack everything into skill power aim to one-shot us with Seekers. Instead, we counter them with our own Seekers that cost less and easily win every single gunfight with double the DPS and similar toughness if they are running heals. Builds that invest something into stamina will have similar to higher DPS, but will have less toughness due to their inefficient allocation of health rolls on their mods, or inefficient rolls into stamina points where we've efficiently ran them into electronics or firearms. If we can survive the initial burst and force them into using their crappy ass heal, they're pretty much dead right there on the spot, even if they don't know it yet, because we recover faster due to our overheal coming back, and we will be at full strength, literally a full 20 to 30 seconds before they are again. The longer the fight goes on with these types of players, the more of a disadvantage they are in. Literally mixing in one dodge roll after the first initial standoff is usually enough to put them so far behind that they are never going to recover. This is especially true for striker builds who will lose almost all of their DPS stack from one dodge roll. So, how do you kill this type of build? Well, you must disrupt my timing by using EMPs or shock turrets and burst me down. Remember, I have horrible flat toughness numbers. My toughness is in my ability to heal myself, and that is why it is important to make sure your miners, if you're running this build, have shock resistance involved somewhere if you're running it. And when they're extremely vulnerable and waiting on their heal to come back, no matter what your situation is on your health, you must push this type of build and try to end it right there. If you wait just a few seconds, then the person running this build will come back with a full overheal with 500,000 DPS and 500,000 toughness, while you are vulnerable also and have no way of getting a heal back and no way to increase your toughness anymore, and you are going to die every single time because you're running a less efficient build. And that's pretty much it, guys. I tried to narrow this build down as much as I could and get straight to the point and explain what it was. Essentially, we are making use of an inefficient allocation of stats. We are essentially abandoning the use of stamina points altogether outside of one stamina mod that I'm running to make sure that I have responsive working. It may be worth, I don't know if that's inefficient there or not, just one mod. Skill haste across all of the mods. And I've talked about all the other spots that I've done anything. If you have any questions about anything that I've talked about, I tried to make this as fast as possible. I didn't want to get crazy with it. I could have talked about this build for 2 days. But there is a real chance that this build becomes the meta. Upper Echelon Gamers actually uploaded a video of an Alpha Bridge build that's somewhat similar to this I noticed today while I was working on this video. I feel like, and I'm not saying anything bad about him, he is where I was a few days ago. He's on the right path over there, but I was trying to do the same thing. Like, that's why I was trying to run 4-piece striker and 2-piece tactician, and he, in some of the same talk and the same language and the same theory that I'm saying in this video is the same thing that he's saying in that video. He just hasn't went past where he's at yet in the character build, and that's just a progression that's naturally going to occur. Right now, I think he's running like a Tenacious Mass or something like that, and Vigorous Chest Piece and 4-piece Alpha Bridge. But you'll notice his DPS is way lower, and he's had to invest way more into electronics to pick up an extra 15% crit damage and the 5% weapon damage that he's getting from Alpha Bridge. His skills aren't coming back as fast. His DPS is much lower, and I think that if he sees this video, he would be like, wow, okay, like that's probably where I was going to end up at, is somewhere like that once he started fine-tuning things a little bit more. But there is that natural tendency, I did it myself, to start looking for this 4-piece combination that fits in, and honestly, I felt like after playing with all kinds of different types of things where I had 2-piece tactician, 4-piece tactician, 3-piece tactician, mixing in 2-piece tactician with other things and removing vigorous, but after looking back at the stats and doing some of the math on it, I just felt like the best combination that I've used so far specifically from my playstyle, like I said, is 3-piece tactician in the build that I showed you guys today. But this thing's extremely versatile. It's really good for groups. It's really good for your teammates. A lot of utility, a ton of toughness, and pretty much I don't ever expect to lose a 1v1. 1v2s are not too bad. When you run into 3 players, you start having a little bit of trouble there. I'm assuming that you're getting ready to start seeing a lot of people run this build, these types of builds. Maybe not this specific build. Like I said, you can take this build and start maneuvering it all over the place, as long as you keep that 2-piece tactician in there to get that 50%, 48% skill haste is what I run. I don't want to overdo it on the skill haste, and I did reload speed on the holster and stuff like that. Some fine-tuning things that I wanted to do for my character. I'm running the burst MP5. You could literally run this with an assault rifle. It's very diverse. It's very powerful right now because it takes advantage. It's a balanced build in an unbalanced meta. The meta right now is a lot of unbalanced builds, and this is a balanced build inside of an unbalanced meta, and that's a very dangerous thing, and it's pretty powerful right now. It will be less powerful down the road. Yeah, some of those people may have better games sometimes, but that's just because they're taking advantage of like poor play by other players, and their builds just maybe counter other people's. But on average, I pretty much finish in first place every single game with this build. I average around 20 some kills almost every single game regardless. This build isn't going to make you overcome a organized group of 4 players with a healer in it, but on the average game that you run into, you don't run into that type of group. So if for people looking that are playing in 2-man groups or don't have a dedicated healer and stuff like that, like, definitely go try this out, and I think you're going to be pretty impressed with it. And let me know what you think. I'll answer any questions you got in the comments. I'm sorry, losing my voice, and I'll talk to you guys in the next video. Let's go. Thanks.